Welcome to Power Behind the Podium, inside the UN Secretary General selection. Most people assume that choosing the Secretary General of the United Nations is a formal, structured, almost democratic hiring process, and technically it is. But that's only part of the story. What I want to show you is how this process actually works and why understanding that matters more than people think. First off, hello. If you're not familiar with me, I'm Sarah Causey, a multi-award-winning author, artist, and biographer of Dag Hammarskjöld. My work centers on the inner life and diplomatic philosophy of one of the most consequential figures in modern international history. I'm the author of Decoding the Unicorn, A New Look at Dag Hammarskjöld, and Simply Dag, the private man in a public and dangerous office. My work brings renewed attention to Dag Hammarskjöld's approach to diplomacy, one grounded in restraint, integrity, and a deep understanding of human complexity. Now to the official process. On paper, the process is very simple. The UN Charter, specifically Article 97, says that the Secretary General is appointed by the General Assembly based on a recommendation from the Security Council. So, in theory, the Security Council selects a candidate and the General Assembly approves them. Clean, straightforward, almost procedural. And if that were the whole story, we'd be done. Since about 2016, the UN has made a real effort to make this process more transparent. Now countries can formally nominate candidates, those candidates submit vision statements, and they participate in public dialogues, essentially open interviews where they answer questions from member states. From the outside, it looks very much like a modern global hiring process. It feels more open, more inclusive, more democratic, and to some extent it is. But this is where perception and reality start to separate just a bit. The real decision-making power still sits with the Security Council, and more specifically with the 5 permanent members, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, China, and Russia. Behind closed doors, they conduct a series of informal votes called straw polls. Each member can encourage, discourage, or abstain. But here's the key detail. If even one of those 5 permanent members marks a candidate as discourage, that's effectively a veto, and that candidate is usually out. So while the public process creates visibility, the actual selection still happens privately, and it's driven by geopolitical realities. The new UN Secretary General is expected to be announced in late 2026, likely between September and December, before the next 5-year term begins on January 1st, 2027. The Security Council held its first informal straw poll in late July 2026 to evaluate the active candidates, and the formal appointment process by the General Assembly will follow. So the current selection timeline looks something like this. July 2026. The UN Security Council began holding initial behind-the-scenes straw polls to narrow down the field of candidates. Fall 2026, additional rounds of straw polls and formal consensus building will take place among the permanent and non-permanent Security Council members. Late 2026, the Security Council will pass a formal recommendation to the UN General Assembly, which will then officially vote to appoint the next leader. So what you end up with is a kind of dual system. On one side, you have the public-facing process, dialogues, vision statements, open participation. On the other side, you have closed-door deliberations, no clearly defined evaluation criteria, and decisions shaped by political negotiation. So the process is more visible than it used to be, but it's not necessarily more open in terms of where the power actually resides. Why does this matter? It matters because it has real implications. Any Secretary General who takes office is stepping into a role shaped by this system. They're expected to represent the interests of almost 200 countries, while also navigating the priorities of the most powerful states in the world. So from the very beginning, there's built-in tension between independence and political survival, between principle and practicality. And this is where Dag Hammarskjöld becomes really interesting. because he didn't go through anything resembling this modern process. In 1953, he wasn't campaigning, he wasn't giving interviews, he wasn't presenting a vision statement. He was essentially selected behind the scenes, and when he received the call telling him that he had been chosen, he thought it was an April Fool's Day joke. And yet, despite emerging from a system that was even more opaque than what we have today, Dag became one of the most independent and principled leaders the UN has ever had. And this raises an interesting question because the system selected him, but it didn't define him. So when we look at the UN Secretary General selection process today, we see something that appears more modern, more transparent, and more structured. But at its core, the balance of power hasn't changed as much as we might think. The process still filters candidates. It still reflects political realities. It still shapes the role before a person ever steps into it. And yet, when someone does, what someone does within that role can still exceed the system that put them there. And that's where the real story begins. Who will be the selected person? To be determined. In the meantime, if you're looking for more and you'd love to learn more about Dag Hammarskjöld, the second Secretary General of the United Nations, the man that Kofi Annan famously called the lodestone, you never make a decision without thinking, what would Dag Hammarskjöld have done in my shoes? Pick up Decoding the Unicorn or simply Dag. They're both available on Amazon. And I will see you next time.